Hello there, I'm Sconchulus, and this is a tier list for every single legendary card currently in TEPPEN standard 30 Minutes.EXE format. This is long overdue, so we're gonna waste no time getting right into this. There'll be timestamps down below for each individual set if you want to see an individual card. Otherwise, the one thing I'm gonna say is this is based on the current ranked standard power level of a card. If it was good before, but it's completely unusable now, it's gonna rank pretty low, even if it's good in a vacuum, and cards that are better in more decks, potentially in every deck, will rank a lot higher than cards that are only good in one niche deck, even if they're really good in that deck. So, with that said, the rankings will become clear, starting things off with Dual Dragon Hado. This is the definition of red, and you're gonna just automatically play it in every red deck. Next we have Dragon Lord's Punishment, which is basically not quite worth the card slot. It's definitely not weak, but there are better things you can be playing for red. Dread King Rathalos is a card that has aged extremely well in the age of power creep. This card is just so high impact, and there's a ton of powerful combos with this card. This is the definition of a good boss monster, and I think will be a bit of a benchmark for our tier list. Next we have Fate-Defying Ryu, the original overpowered card. A removal spell on legs every 5 seconds, a win condition, and an unrespondable game ender. This is an S tier card as long as there's a deck that wants to play it, and right now Burn.EXE takes pretty good advantage of the card, so at least for now he is going up to S tier. Moving on to the green cards, these ones haven't fared quite as well. Roaring Typhoon is a horrible meta call, and if you're playing MS Green-Black Dante, MS Dante, you'll play it for the gimmick, but otherwise it's really bad. Next, Advanced Artifact X. I wish I could think of something positive to say, but there's no synergy with him or really any deck that wants to play him. The only reason I'm not giving him D is because he buffs up something else. So there's probably something newer and better than him that you're using him for. Next we have Heavenly Kicks Chun-Li, who is definitely really outdated. On her own, she is just a huge liability and is just asking to get blown out, leaving you way behind, is what I'd be saying if I wasn't paying attention. This card was recently broken wide open by the one and only Kame-san Games in a red-green dive attack deck, where this is one of the big payoffs that you're building towards. She is completely unstoppable and game-ending in that deck, and it's only one deck, otherwise I would definitely give her A tier just for her power level. Soul Offering is not a card that any deck wants to play. It's a funny gimmick if you're really feeling really funny. Next we have Dante is a classic win condition type of card. There's a great deck you could play him in. Purple Demons is built entirely around demons and has an easy way to resonate him, but doesn't even consider playing the card. He's just too much of a liability. Basically everything I said about X, but I can't really give him any benefit of the doubt. And moving on to Morrigan, everything that I said for Dante goes double for her, because there's 2 powerful meta decks that would potentially play her. Halt and Demons don't even consider Morrigan for a second because she is just too clunky. Next we have Devil Trigger, which is basically Dante in a can. Make anything scarier than Dante, but you need to have a solid board already on board to use this, but it's super scary always. I don't really feel like any need to downplay the card. It just needs something to come around to find it useful. It doesn't really do anything in standard at the moment. And next we have the ultimate purple card. Brainwashed is as good and better than every other card your opponent is playing. I could talk for any amount of time about how good Brainwashed is. And Black's cards from Core have probably fared the worst. Heir to Ambition Rusker is a funny meme with choral orchestra evasive action, but evasive was nerfed and you can't even reset Wesker with it, so there's almost nothing to do with this card. I only am leaving it out of F out of respect for whoever likes the card, honestly. And the same I cannot do for Legend Eater Wesker. The biggest weakness of this card is that it destroys a third of your deck, which is all going to be better. Even just the vanilla 6MP 4/9 is not really cutting it these days. Next we have Spreading Infection, which is great Ascend fodder, but Raging Demon is not being played by really anybody, and Bringer of Nightmares has better things to do. Giving your opponent infected is a punishment of modern cards, so I think that really says it all. And last from core we have Blood Destiny, a card that I undoubtedly fear. And as long as the Killer Ball deck is in Standard, it is a very scary card. Moving on to Jurassic Rampage, also some of the oldest cards in Standard. These also haven't really fared super well to power creep. President's Agent Leon has pretty much fallen out of favor, but Gale had a recent comeback, so I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and give him a low B placement. Next we have Jungle Boss Kongalala, a classic big red boss monster who is very difficult to deal with, potentially with unit combat at least, but he doesn't really take any advantage of the modern big red combo sort of cards that would enable him, so I'm gonna have to give him a C tier. Next, Agents Alliance is a completely generic card for any red deck. This is a great card. The only possible negative I could say is the modern red deck wants to do 3 damage and not 2, but it's such a good cycle I cannot put it below B+. Next we have Killing Machine Hugh 8-Cell. I love any card that is completely generic. You can play this in any green deck for a solid beater, but that is literally all this guy does, and in that way he is basically totally outclassed by modern stuff. Ancient Tyrant T-Rex. And this card absolutely wrecks. If this was at the height of its power, I would just throw this right to S tier. This is one of my most hated cards ever. It's so impossible to deal with at times, but I guess most green players just don't have the room for it anymore, is really all it seems like. I think this card is a nightmare, but it's just kind of not really the most modern card ever. I don't know why more people aren't playing it. It's a beast. On the other hand, the support card that goes with it, you'd have to be playing a completely monster-focused deck, and you can just remove the monster to deny the damage. This card is pretty bad. And next we have Team Chaotix Vector. This is a pretty good tech in the modern Temptation deck if you can find the room for it. You're already playing 4s, but I think it's just a little too inconsistent. Even though the power level is very solid, I'm just gonna give it a mid-tier B placement. Next we have Twisted Mind Sergeus. A card that on release, the consensus basically was that it had a ton of potential for the future of Standard with whatever purple 5 machines they designed going forward. And holy cow, did that not happen. This is one of the most disappointing cards I can think of, and the deck that it was printed for has only gotten worse every single rotation. I honestly don't feel like F tier is even being too harsh on Sergeus. The next card we have fared a lot better at the time. Wolfpack was briefly adopted by top players playing the best deck Temptation, but they had to play some weird cards like Tuskull, and I think most people realized that that wasn't quite cutting it and wasn't worth it. But the power level of this card was more than worth it and winning a lot of games. It's a really, really scary card. You just have to weaken your whole deck to play it if you're playing Temptation. Next, black cards are pretty dang dated. Third Energy Genius Kirk is support for the Invasion Black deck, which I haven't seen in at least a couple months. I don't think he's even very good in that deck, and it's one of the slowest control decks ever. Next, we have a card that on release was an absolute staple in every black deck, just for the pure value and inevitability, but I'm just gonna spoil things here. This is gonna be my big hot take of the tier list. I think this card is not very good for black right now. Ouroboros and Dark Invitation really don't want to play it to summon better things. And newer decks like Spike Dive Bomb don't want to play it because they want to use the board for other more complicated, higher impact plays. The big problem is that you commit 2 slots to the board for a huge amount of time, and it's just not worth it these days. Last of all, third Energy Restored. Despair Whale and Perish has rotated out of Standard, so this card is unplayable at the moment. Next we have the Goo, who I've always felt like was the goo in whatever deck he was in. That is to say, the secret sauce that got you that extra distance. He's just basically a board wipe at any moment, potentially, a bunch of value. I really feel like I gotta give this guy an A just for the generic and high power level. Next we have AMSF Shiba, who is not remotely generic. You're only playing this in Explore, and it is a late game card which takes a long time to build. I really don't like how long it takes to build this card. I really feel like I'm gonna have to give this about a C tier placement because it takes so long to come online. I feel like Explorer might even just have better things to do. Last of all for red here, we've got Emergency System Go, another completely generic card which gets it a ton of points in my book, and this one is supremely high impact. The only downside is that it hits your side of the board as well, and you have to destroy something, but the destroying something is one of the best parts of the card. Having something to protect yourself from brainwashed is a big reason that you will play this card. At least for now, I'm gonna give it a low A placement, and we'll see if it's able to stay there. Next up, we have Guard Spike Rose Red, a gimmick if ever there was one. This guy is all about moving around the board, and you gotta dedicate more than half of your deck to cards that move you around the board if you want to play him right. The gimmick is amazing, and this dude steals so many games, but he's the ultimate gimmick, honestly. Next we have AMSF Cammy, who is a liability in anything other than Heart Tank. But in Heart Tank, she is genuinely very scary, so I'm gonna respect that one deck alone and give her a B tier placement. Next we have Anti-Machine Squad Force, a card that's a bunch of value for 4 MP, but is locked to a deck that's not really that strong right now. Coral Humans is definitely a mid-tier deck, so I'm gonna give the card a mid-tier placement. Card Boomer Kuwanger, basically hyped up as the new deacidal Schemer Wesker. He removes anything and turns it into fodder on board. But he was really overhyped. I mean, I have seen this card very few times. It's a good early gameplay, it feels like, but I feel like the cost holds him back, and the restriction really holds him back. AMSF Simone, a starter kind of card for a decent rogue deck, but my main question with this card is if she's really all that good of a starter in that deck. Locke is definitely an okay deck, but it's not going super far, and this is one of the more questionable cards in it. Purple's last OCS card is Tag Team Brothers, which I think is super underrated considering the synergy with the modern Blackout removal deck. I will say, don't take my word too far for it, Okami's rank 1 list definitely didn't play this card, but I don't know why more people don't. I think it's really solid and underrated, and it's around for about 3 more months, so I think it's worth messing around with the card still. Next we have AMSF Spencer, a very kind of choreographed card, I feel like. He's just really exclusively for the format he came out in, and has not really shown himself to be worth playing in Sekia, so I'm gonna give him a mid-tier C placement. Next we have the star of the Killer Ball format and that specific deck, but it's not the highest power level thing, it's just a great thing to do in the Killer Ball deck, which is a great deck, but a rogue deck if there ever was one. And Bionic Arm is a board wipe type of card that we have seen to be very weak in the face of power creep. There's better stuff. And moving on to the finale of the Sigma's trilogy, Sigma's Invasion. Finally, some cards that truly escape power creep, starting off with Sonic Vanguard Guile. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say this might be the very best card currently in the format. Just like our other cards in S, it destroys any other card and is the most powerful early game threat that you can throw down on turn 1. Completely backbreaking and game winning at any stage of the game. Guile is also gonna be in every red deck, is a big part of his top of S placement. Next we have Scarlet Heroine Regina, who is a high power ceiling card, but one that I find extremely clunky and ineffective. The best thing she can do is get you a free dive attack, but you have to hugely lower your DPS on board just to play her, and even when you do, it's not really worth it. You're probably gonna win off of one dive attack anyway. Maybe there's a deck in the future that can use her, but for now, I think Regina is a very questionable card. Even more questionable is Lost Civilizations Defiled, where I can't even really explain the intended design of this card. If it was meant for the growth decks that it came out with, then you'd have spent too much MP to make the 6 MP follow-up for the growth plays, so it doesn't make sense for that. Maybe it's for something in the future that they haven't released yet, so keep your eye on it, I guess. But right now, this is easily Red's worst legendary. Next we have Rainbow Bomber Armika, the enabler for Coral Humans, which we already talked about is kind of a mid-tier type of deck, and she is a mid to late game card, which is gonna keep her from going any higher than B tier. Moving on, Steel Hero Massimo is another completely generic card, which immediately spoils that my opinion is pretty high of him. I love any card that can go in any deck, and as far as power level goes, this is one of the very strongest things you can be doing in green at the moment. If you're not playing Green.EXE specifically, you should definitely be playing something that can use Massimo. Another home run for green, we have End of Fate, which fits in our theme of just perfect cards in S tier that are removal for anything, cards that are stronger than every other card basically. Purple's cards for Sigma's Invasion are an interesting mixed bag. Let's start with Mother Computer Akatsuki, which is in theory better brainwashed for 1 less MP, but it's random and it can be reverted, which is crazy. All you get in return for that is you get a blocker on board, which you definitely don't want to use as a blocker. This is a super weird card, but I can't say it's genuinely bad, it's just bad in practice. I'm sure somebody who's really good can get good results with it, but it's just too much of a liability. Next we have Soaring Breeze Ibuki, a card that has basically no downside of any kind. You can and will play this in every purple deck. It's completely generic, and it is just an absurd amount of value playing it. She is a big part of why overall purple is probably the strongest color at the moment. Next we have Tribe in Peril, a card that you would think they would have learned their lesson from Core. It's just the same mistake as Legend Eater Nergigante, but you're throwing away 5 cards instead of 10. This card should definitely only affect one side of the board, or have something else strong about it. Make it remove the cards or something. But as it is, nobody has been sold on this card. Next we have the star of the Sigma trilogy, the Sigma Invading Sigma. This dude is good in Ouroboros, since you can always bring him back once he transforms. But that's also the biggest knock against him, because Ouroboros wants that consistency for their 9-drops, so they don't want this card. And if you're not playing a graveyard deck, he's not quite as worth it. I, however, think this card is great because of the life gain. That's the main reason you're going to play this card in a modern Teppen deck, is to gain a bunch of life if your opponent can't stop it, and that is often going to be very worth doing. Next is Masterwork, MS Zangief. This dude is in every graveyard deck right now and is such high impact, especially in the right matchup where he can copy something from the opposing graveyard, and when he gets to the size that can destroy anything when he's played, he is just a monster. But to get that second effect requires a lot of investment. That's the only real reason I'm not giving him A+, and that you're never really gonna play him from hand. Next we have a hugely buffed card, Mirage Soldiers. Gives the card 3/6 and basically reads, you are about to win the game, with minimal counterplay. The only thing really holding it back is that it's only in sacrifice decks, and you have to sacrifice 12 life. So you are on the brink of death once you do have this online. Next, we are moving on to Turnabout Festival. We're starting off with the red cards. These were all kind of hurt by the nerfs to red evidence, and part-time bellhop Sakura I was never really a super big fan of to start with. She's cool, and her attacking effect is fun, but she's not the card you want to spend evidence on, ever. Evidence decks pretty much only spend evidence on fireworks, and only have room for it as well. Not even really making room for Suspect Cutie BB Hood. High impact as she is, you're just splashing the deck with something else to make up for the weaknesses it caught to nerfs. Next we have Pharmaceutical Fracas, the card with the biggest variability of any card in the list. For players like me and most of my viewers, this is an F tier card where on activation you will throw the game away. But for top 100 players, this is like a B+. You're not playing it this format, I don't think. I've really seen many decks with it, but it's a very high skill ceiling card that can be punishing at the right moment. Next, we have some of my favorite cards in Standard, the green evidence cards, starting with Ace Attorney Apollo. This is probably green's highest power ceiling card at the moment. It is unreal impact and will steal any game where he gets on the board. The only limit is the extremely high cost to play him from hand. Next, we have the combo enabler for evidence decks, which is really that and nothing else. She's a bit one note, but she's pretty strong, so we're gonna give Silk Defendant Trucy a B tier. And next, another fully generic card, which just spirals value as long as you can play cards. We have Enchanting Nightpool. I love this card, but I don't think the best green decks are finding room for it right now. Green.EXE doesn't play it, but I think anything else should absolutely play this card, and it is just worth investing in if you play green at the moment. Purple's Turnabout Festival cards are interesting. The evidence-focused ones were nerfed slightly. We'll start with Tessa, the suspicious suspect, who is a lot harder to reach the point in the game where you would play her. On field, she is a beast and is going to be super difficult to deal with outside of a Guile, but actually reaching that point of the game is so hard with the gimped version of the deck. I haven't seen anybody actually do it since the nerfs, so I'm gonna give her a theoretical placement right behind the suspect cutie. Next, we have VIP Discovery, which was the card hurt the least by the nerfs, and is the big selling point for the evidence strategy, I feel like. Definitely a strong card depending on the meta, but you gotta get lucky with it. It's kind of one of Purple's biggest gimmicks, so I don't feel like I can give it higher than B. Last for Purple here, we have Daimyo's Dog Pinscher. All this card is a very above curve 3-drop, but somehow that is just absolutely incredible. I guess Purple players have just gotten really good at playing it, but a turn 1 Daimyo's Dog, or Ibuki into the dog, just a dog at the right time, is backbreaking, and Purple players are really good at using it. It's not broken pushing it into S, but it's in literally every Purple deck. Next, Black's TF cards are super controversial. Clavier Gavin is basically the actual replacement for Deocidal Schemer Wesker we were always waiting for, who was an S tier card. But this is like the really fair version of Wesker. He is not doing anything broken when he hits the field. It's good value, but it's not broken value. Even though he's in every black deck, I really don't feel like he's doing anything unfair at all. I'm just gonna give him the very, very top of A tier. Next, we have Elite Suspect Excella Gioni, who has just a super frustrating, completely unique effect that no other card in Teppen has, being Hand Rip, and targeted Hand Rip at that. Getting the strongest card out of your hand anytime she hits the field, which will often be like 3 times a game. Excella is a card that is frustrating like no other. The fully generic nature of the card and the generally just above curve stats make this card one of the best that Black gets to play this format. And next to the new Gaviners is undoubtedly one of the highest power level cards we are going to talk about. The only thing keeping it out of S is that more and more stuff comes out to contest the power of Dark Invitation. There are massive counters in the form of Blackout, and that hurts the deck. It's no longer the best black deck, so I am just gonna give the card a high A+ tier placement. And that brings us to Demon Dogfight. Starting things off with red, we have Dark Scion Dimitri. Basically all he does is swing for an unrespondable game-ending lethal punch, but he does it at such a high life total, up to 10 life, and he's so good at doing it that I cannot give him any lower than A tier. Following that up, we have Scion and Silver, one of the absolute highest power level cards in red, only limited by being a very late game card. But it's way more flexible than Dimitri, and it's also in the best red deck at the moment, so I think I can give it a low A+, at least for now. Next we have Right Hand Demon Burial, who I would have probably given a B-ish tier placement if it weren't for Kamai-san hitting rank 1 with the card in his dive attack list. This card is really good against red, which is extremely powerful at the moment, basically only countered by our rank 1 card here, and it's just a very high power level card. It's just generic and it does a lot. Next we have Green's Explore cards, starting off with Master Swordsman Nagi. This guy ends the game basically guaranteed if he hits the field, but to really make him worth playing, you've got to do really well for a long time with a deck that's not top tier. It's definitely tier 2, but the fact he's limited to like the last 2 minutes of the game lose a lot of points for me on Nagi, and especially the fact that he is outclassed by a newer legendary we will talk about later. I think this guy can easily have the argument for much higher tier, but I think he's a bit too narrow in my eyes. On the other hand, we have Little Sprite Sakuya, who is baseline in any deck, a 2MP 2/7 that explodes for a shield. That is already great, and if you can activate her second effect, she is absolutely frightening. After that, let's go Garangolm, a card that arguably does absolutely nothing. It provides plus X minus X, if you were wondering. It's kind of weird to parse, but this card is so flashy and cool, but it's definitely not a strong card in the literal sense. You've got to use it in a way that makes it strong, but it's too cool to give anything lower than a high B placement. And moving on to another set of very controversial cards, we have Purple's Demon Dogfight card, starting with new Demon Queen Morrigan. Just in the title of the cards, letting you know that this card will be one of the queens of the format. This is a back-breaking card, countering anything else, and providing a mountain to climb in the form of the life gain. The only reason I'm not giving it S tier is because it's only in one deck, and you usually use it late game. It's only doing one thing that the deck already does plenty well. And let's just follow that up, talking about the still much stronger half of the combo. These are honestly the exact same two cards in a different form, but the Queen and the Wolf is much higher impact even after the nerfs. I wish I didn't have to give this card A+ tier, but it is one of the strongest things that Purple can possibly do right now. Desdemona, General of the Genma, is exactly the same, honestly, but is limited to a much weaker deck. However, her power level, let's not downplay it at all. She is going to win if she activates. And Black's Demon Dogfight cards. I should really stop mentioning when cards are controversial, because these are also some pretty talked about cards, I would say. We'll start things off with the Demon King Mundus, who is basically, in my eyes, a revisit of this Sigma with the intention of making him entirely better for some reason. This card has fewer restrictions and is higher impact. The only downside I can think of is that he is once per game. A huge part of Ouroboros being top 3 decks right now is this guy alone. Next we have Underworld Lord Raptor, who is on the exact same level of power. Even after being nerfed, nothing has changed. This card does so much. In a single card, we have Graveyard Setup, a board wipe, a huge body on board, life gain, and a generally powerful proactive play that the deck otherwise lacks. Jetta is the absolute whole package, and I honestly feel like I should give him a low S tier. I don't want to following the nerfs, but I really feel like considering everything he does, he deserves an S tier placement. Following that up, we have, I forget the name of this one, but it's the board wipe, and it's honestly not remotely necessary in the deck somehow. It's completely way above curve, just showing that they wanted this iteration of Ouroboros to be powerful for no reason, but the deck doesn't even need to run it. I mean, it does, but it's just optional, honestly. It's broken and it's optional. Next, we have Battle Chip Hero Ryu.exe, which, just real quick, it's really weird to me that he's Ryu.exe. He's not a NetNavi, it's just the real Ryu, but he got sent to the internet. So he's Ryu.exe for some reason, and they'll never explain what they meant by that. Anyway, I think paying 7 MP for a 4/7 or a 5/9 is just horrible. One of the worst things I've ever felt doing in Standard. But the Hado Shot is amazing. I love Hado Shot, and he's really fun in big red decks. I don't know what else is going to even try to play him, but I think it's an okay card. It's not as bad as it seems like it is, but it's definitely not very good. After that, we have, I didn't even realize we're at 3ME, and these cards are kind of all over the place. The Blazing Net Navi Fireman is a good example. He's a bit of a mid-tier card in my opinion. The need to get burn 6 isn't great, and he's not super exceptional, honestly, on the board. The removal is good, but if you summon him with his action, you're less likely to get the unit in front damage, and he's just a little bit lower power level than I feel like he needed to be meta. The current Burn.EXE decks have found their footing without Flame Man, so that kind of speaks to a mid-tier power level for him. The same I would definitely say for Final Battle, which the biggest weakness here is the randomness. Even without playing Flame Man, you aren't gonna know if you have a Gutsman set up in your Banished because it never tells you. This is a cool, high impact kind of card, but there's a lot holding it back. Next we have Green's cards, which immediately made a huge splash in the meta. These are fantastic cards, the strongest of which being Justice Net Navi Mega Man.exe. This is an immediate game winner. There is no other way to read the effects on this card, but he takes a lot of investment to get there. Kind of the same story as Zangief, but he is also playable in a bunch of green decks like Growth and anything they potentially print in the future, which gets him very, very high rankings from me. Next we have Roll.exe, who is a early game winner, which makes her very unique compared to most of the other cards we've talked about, but she's held back by being very difficult to use and requiring specific setups to get going. Next we have Gyakuten, a card I was super excited for, to just copy my win conditions and make them into additional win conditions. I mean, if I give it to Ryu, there's 2 of him, that's an S tier card, but in reality, this is way too expensive and just didn't really find any home at all. If you have a strong deck for Gyakuten, let me know. I'll play any Gyakuten decks I see, but there isn't really a compelling reason to play it right now, and I wish it had been able to live up to the Gyakuten hype. Next we have Crimson Net Navi, Protoman.exe, who was, in my opinion, basically solved recently by Okami, who recently was able to reach rank 1 in her deck playing this card along with the other purple EXE cards. I think we all are finally seeing just how solitary of a threat Protoman is, especially if you pair him with his signature action Official Navi's Power, which is just by design. It seems like they wanted to make a better Brainwashed. It's not actually that. I would say this card seems better than it is, being just 4 MP to delete anything. It is literally that. But you do have to pay the cost of the unit, so sometimes I've seen people die after they cast it. But I can't downplay at all. It's one of the strongest cards they have ever made. Next we have Shadowman.exe, which is kind of not the same story as Protoman. I think most people have found that Protoman is the more consistent, higher impact version, and this guy's just more of the same, so you don't necessarily need him. Moving on to the final 3ME cards, Black's cards, we'll start things off with Jet Black Net Navi Base.exe. Just the coolest card from the new set, honestly, and the best card in his deck. It might be a bit of an overrate, but this guy turns the game on its head the second he ascends, and when you Spike Dive Bomb him, you are guaranteed to win. I guess the big impact is limited just to Spike Dive Bomb, but I think that is a criminally underrated deck at the moment, and we will only see more of it in the future, which is why I'm giving Base a low A+ tier. Next, not the same story at all, we have Network Invader M. Bison, who I just don't understand. It's honestly the same problem as I have with Tyrant, but much worse, because it requires setup, and it's just super clunky, especially when you're playing cards like Cyber Akuma that also revived. So if he ends up on the board at the same time as this guy, you're only getting 1. There are huge problems, and I don't know what they really expected us to do with this card, but it's really not worth playing. Last of all, we have Afterduel, which I think people have finally learned how to play, and it is very worth playing. This card is a kind of necessary insurance policy for Spike Dive Bomb if you kind of let your plays get away from you. I've been playing a lot of this deck, and it's difficult, so having this as a band-aid solution to get you back in the game is a little bit necessary in a lot of cases. And now we finally have the supplemental battle chips, the final cards we will rank today, and some of the flashiest and most interesting ones at that. We'll start things off with the battle chip PRL 13. I don't remember this one. This was a hard one. And I think the consensus is really, why would you play this? It's just Blackout in a can, and you're probably already playing Blackout for this type of strategy, so you don't need more of it. Green's battle chip was Hero Sword version 3, which is a very confusing card. I honestly haven't played it enough to know if the downside matters or not. It doesn't feel like it does, but that's probably just me not paying attention. This card is honestly a mystery. It seems incredible to me, but it's just impossible to tell, honestly. At the very least, it's really fun and it does win games, so I'm gonna give it a B tier type of placement. And now let's talk about it. Battle Chip Valstrox version 3 is a card that effectively reads, you win the game at Burn 9. Burn 9 is of course almost impossible to reach, and you have to specifically build a deck intended just to activate this card, which should in theory gimp your deck severely. However, Kame-san, we already talked about him recently, created the deck that breaks this card, and because of that, I can't possibly give it any lower than an A tier placement. It's only used in this one deck list. I don't even think you can change the deck list and still activate this card, and it only does one thing, so it's gonna be A and not A+, but the power level is absolutely an A+ level card. And last we have Battle Chip Ruiner Felicia version 3, a really cute and fun card that I was excited to play. But I don't think it really does anything special. It doesn't push its deck over the edge, it just kinda does what the deck is already doing, but it lets you win one specific action phase really hard. Doesn't really change any of the math for the deck though, so I'm just gonna give it a B+ placement. And here we are again. I've moved a couple of the things around. You can see some changes, and I'm gonna make one last extremely controversial change. Ryu isn't played in the best red decks right now. They don't have the room, really, I think is the main reason, so I'm just moving him right down to A+. This is a very high power level. He's better than this card, I think, which means he's insane. But you don't need him to be playing the very best red deck right now. With that said, the tier list we do have here, in S we have the very strongest cards in the game, which are beating every other card with no way around it really. In A+, we have cards that are a higher power level than absolutely anything else. And down in A, we have cards that are basically about the same power level, but might be a bit later game or something like that. Down in B+, these cards are also an extremely high power level, or at the very least generically fantastic, but there might be something holding them back, like the deck they're limited to, or the format we're currently in. Down into B tier, we kind of have the benchmark of the tier list, where everything above Rathalos is undeniably excellent in some way or another, while everything below him has some kind of problem with it. Every card in B tier is still definitely great, but it might be a little harder to use in some situations. Down in C tier, the story is basically that these cards are either too clunky, too slow, or just too low of a power level to really cut it. And in D tier, the clunkiness takes things to another level, while in F tier, we have the only cards that I would say genuinely failed. With that, we have ranked every single card in Standard. Let me know down below if there's anything you would rank higher or lower, if there's anything you're excited to see placed where it was, and what you think of the tier list. Thanks for watching. Please like the video if you liked the video, subscribe if you subscribed. Once again, I'm Sconchulous, and I'll see you in the next one.